time, from 2007 to 2008, I worked at a practice called Bryan Architects, where I mostly worked on educational projects, which involved primary and secondary schools and higher education, which involves universities and colleges. And during my time at Bryan, I was introduced to building information modeling, which is more widely used in the industry now. It was introduced in part when I was in Sumaya and Kalappa Consultants in 2005. Our practice at the time there was working with an American practice in a project in Bangalore. HLM Architects were the winners of the Architects Journal 100 Employer of the Year Awards 2 years in a row, so we're very proud of that achievement. And at the heart of everything we do is to ensure that we're creating places that make people happy, and there's a thoughtful process to it. So it's not just ensuring that we meet the client's brief, it's also making sure that we go over and above what the clients are asking for and actually helping inform the clients and how things can be made better. There are many different metrics that building designs can be attributed to, and a couple of metrics that have been introduced recently is the incorporation of social value, which there's a lot of guidance about, at least in the British government guidelines, and also sustainability matrix. In terms of the disciplines that we cover, obviously there's architecture, but there's also interior design, landscape architecture, master planning, and environmental sustainability. There are times when these disciplines will work standalone with other clients or with other architects and designers, but we also offer these services as a whole. And it might help you in understanding how we do certain things. And if you think it might help, you could incorporate some of that structure within how things are done in India as well. So there are many different bodies in the UK. The Architects Registration Board is the board that all the architects are registered to. All the architects need to carry their own insurances. And then there's satellite bodies like the Royal Institute of British Architects, the RIBA, who set guidelines and procedures for architects to follow. Now, a lot of these procedures are just guidelines, like I've said, but what happens is, because they're the leading body, the government and the local councils, they use their guidelines to set the parameters for their design briefs. So in a way, what the RIBA does, even though it's not technically law, it does get valued as such. So the slide that you can see on your screen right now is basically how a project gets split from conception to completion. So there's 7 different stages in a project's life, starting at stage 0 and completing at stage 5. The architects most traditionally are involved in a project from stage 1 to stage 6, but we're also extending our services onto stage 7. So I'll just give you a really quick description of what all this means. Stage 1, preparation and briefing, is normally following on from stage 0 when there is an outline brief that has been prepared. So normally there would be an accommodation schedule with an occupancy dividing a building or an estate into different zones, departments, different types of spaces, etc. And this is where we start getting involved. So we would sit down with the client, try and understand what they want from the project, review their outcomes in terms of the project, sustainability, what their quality aspirations are. At this stage, we would undertake very high-level feasibility studies, understand what their budget is, and get all the site information through site surveys for the project. So we'd get topographical surveys, flood risk surveys, ecological surveys, any survey that would help with the planning process. In terms of planning, depending on the complexity of the projects, we have a process which is called pre-application, where we submit the designs for planning advice prior to the formal planning application, which happens at stage 3. So we would do that at stage 2 as well. So we'd submit a pre-planning application, and we would agree how we would get building regulations approval at the end of the project at stage 5. So building regulations is basically ensuring that there's compliance with all the technical standards and ensuring that the building meets the relevant structural, thermal, fire safety measures, ventilation measures, hygiene and sanitation measures. So building regs in the UK is divided into a number of different sections, and we have to make sure that the design meets all those standards to get a pass certificate. Depending on the project type, scale, and procurement route, you may or may not have different consultants on board at that time. So if it is a very complex project, we would have structural engineers and civil engineers and M&E engineers, landscape consultants, etc. So between stages 3, 4, and 5, in terms of when the detailed drawing information is produced and when work starts on site. So work starts on site at stage 5 normally. So sometimes stages 4 and 5 start blending depending on the procurement route. So if we did a traditional contract, we would finish all the technical drawings first, send it out for tender, get it priced. So this diagram illustrates that in terms of the construction industry, we're utilizing 17.5% of the energy is produced through greenhouse gases directly. But if you include part of the iron and steel industry, which is at the top over there, the construction industry is actually responsible for the most greenhouse gases, which is quite staggering. And there's a very strong drive in the Western world, at least, to try and reduce greenhouse gases as much as we can. The world have made promises, at least, to try and reduce their emissions by 2050 to net zero carbon. And I won't go into that into too much detail because this is more about buildings, but just to understand it from a construction point, carbon is generated in buildings in 2 forms. So there's embodied carbon, which is generated from the extraction of materials, manufacturing, transportation, and installation of those materials on site. So anything to do with extraction of materials through to manufacturing, transport, a significant amount of energy is consumed as embodied energy, something that we're doing a lot of right now. So this is just an example of how these buildings get slotted into place. So in terms of cladding, these buildings can be clad with anything, really. So it's slightly limiting in what you can do with the shape because of the way it needs to be transported, and where there can be gains and losses in efficiencies. But overall, from an environmental perspective, it's definitely the way to go.